All right, thank you for joining us today's fireside chat about cloud trends hosted by Capital One. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our featured speakers today. First, I'll start with Laura Nelson. She's the VP of Research at Forrester, and she manages Forrester's cloud analysts. Lauren's specialties are cloud management, private cloud, open source strategy, cloud migration, portability, government cloud, and diversity and inclusivity programs. Next, Allison Perkel. She's our Vice President of Engineering and Tech Commercialization at Capital One. Over her 25-year career, she's set and led the strategy around moving, transforming, and launching new products in the cloud. Allison has been involved in the Boston tech scene for most of her career. And a little bit about myself. My name is Maurice. I'm the General Manager and Technical Product Lead for Tech Commercialization at Capital One. I've worked in product management and product development at Bose, Epson, iRobot, Sonos, and Fitbit. And I've got an MBA focused on managing technological interface and transfer, and I'm looking forward to being your moderator today. Let's start with a question for Allison. Allison, I'd love for you to tell us about Capital One's journey into the cloud.
Hi, thank you. That's a great question to kick off with. So Capital One is one of those companies that likes disrupting things. If you look at how we started off with credit cards, we completely disrupted that business. And about a little over 8 years ago, we realized that another big disruption was coming. And that really is how to harness and utilize cloud technology to really expand how we operate, how to bring a better customer experience, how to deliver value real time to our customers. And that kind of began our journey for how we moved from a on-prem legacy backend solution to being all in on the cloud. And as of this year, no longer having any on-prem data centers left. We've exited those, which is a really amazing thing to do. As we went through this journey, we also found that the ability to use modern technology stacks. Capital One made use of open source technologies as we adopted agile practices across the organization. This really became a journey about the company, not about the technology, which for really successful transformations to cloud, in our case, AWS cloud, it's a critical piece to have that company be all in. And that was one of the most amazing parts of the story, and really any cloud transformation story, is watching the entire company change as it goes through this shift from a on-prem owning its own data centers all the way to a cloud-based making enablement or taking advantage of the wonderful open source community, of giving back to the open source community, taking advanced practices like DevOps and now GitOps, CI/CD, and really making them our own. And we're still on that journey. This journey doesn't end. And it's really an amazing experience to help take us to that next step, that next level that's coming and is always coming in technological journeys.
Thanks for that, Allison. Lauren, I'd love to hear from you on what some of the biggest cloud trends are that we can expect in 2021 and for the longer term.
Sure, thank you. So, hi everybody. I've been following cloud for about a decade now. And in the early days, you saw a lot of conversations around building net new functionality. It was very much a build story. And then in 2015, there was this new conversation in market around migrating existing workloads to the public cloud. And that changed the conversation in the market. And most notably at reInvent in 2015, with both Capital One and GE going on main stage and talking about this profound change in their cloud strategy. More recently, we see a lot of organizations talking about modernization, about taking existing applications and applying modernizations to those workloads to either connect to new systems or to optimize them for the new demands that those applications are being asked to do. And through this journey over the past decade, you see a lot of transitions in those conversations. You see the conversation switch between, what's virtualization versus private cloud, to what is hybrid cloud versus multi-cloud. And more recently, a lot of the conversation is around how cloud, do we need to be specific about those definitions, or is cloud just the latest moniker that we use to talk about modern, what a modern infrastructure strategy should be? If we look at the past year in 2020, it was a really extraordinary year for a lot of companies out there, where they were pushed to adapt in new ways that they never previously had to. So when you're looking at cloud trends today, it's an interesting point in which we're reaching this level of maturity and this level of scale in which we never previously had. We're entering into this element where we're looking at modernization and looking at taking some of our most cherished workloads and incorporating those within our cloud strategies, all while we find this very immediate need to adapt and be able to get really real-time benefits from a cloud platform. So when we look at 2020 and moving into 2021, a lot of the journeys for organizations is around, well, how do I get short-term wins? How do I lean on it for building new things like remote pickup apps, being able to think about how I might look at my supply chain differently, or be able to address the new demand in e-commerce that I might not previously have experienced? How do I meet those real-time needs while being able to think about some of the long-term elements my cloud strategy should be taking at this point in my maturity? So we've reached this level of scale. What's the appropriate way to approach cloud governance these days? What is the right level of thing my organization should be thinking about when it comes to a network architecture? Are there elements of my cloud strategy that need to mature and grow up? And if you look at a lot of cloud strategies today, they're tightly infused with container conversations. And I'm sure we'll get more heavily into those in a bit. The only other trend I did want to call out is industry specific. So now that we've similarly reached this further stage of maturity, a lot of organizations are asking, how do organizations like me think about the latest maturity within their cloud strategy? What collections of services across IaaS to SaaS are appropriate for my industry? What unique services are available? What have others in my industry done that aren't quite like others, that don't have the same needs, the same regulations that my organization does?
Thank you both for those insights here. I'd like to shift to one of the key focus areas for Capital One and many other organizations, and that's containers and container adoption. Lauren, you just mentioned it a moment ago, and I'd love to hear from you a little more about container adoption study conducted by Forrester Consulting on behalf of Capital One.
Sure. So I think it was June in 2020, we did a joint survey that went out to the market and really sought what is the latest trends that organizations are doing for containers. So in the early days of containers, there were a lot of associations of, are containers just being used for test dev? How were they being used? Is it for new apps? Is it for existing? And we wanted to get the latest look at how organizations are using containers for what workloads, where are they experiencing problems? What does this really look like at scale? So we looked at this study. We had a number of really great takeaways that tried to dig into those issues. So some of the key callouts I'll have. So 86% of organizations are using containers today. When you look at how they're using the technologies themselves, 65% of container users today supplement their governance for containers with a third-party management offering. 30% of organizations are building their own tooling on top of the container platform that they're using. We saw a lot of organizations focusing on containers for migrating custom applications to a public cloud platform. We saw, I believe that was 46% are using it for that particular use case. 44% are using it for building net new stateless applications. Some other interesting sets that came out from it, we looked not just at what are they doing today, but what are they anticipating doing in the next 2 years? What are the transitions that they anticipate? And in the early days of container usage, there were a lot of stories that were primarily on premises in an on-prem data center, and that were launching containers behind their own firewall, often circumventing their own internal governance processes. We see a lot of that reality changing. In fact, the biggest change we saw in this findings over the next 2 years, organizations are going to be shifting from a primarily on-premises container strategy to one that spans to the public cloud. Over the 2 year, it was a negative growth of 54% that organizations will be making that transition. So we see more complex container strategies that are bridging these two worlds. And with that, we expect a lot of organizations to start double downing on topics like governance to be able to make sure that they're meeting the needs. And when you dig into the types of workloads that are involved in these decisions, you'll see that they're critical ones. They're major systems of record applications. They're net new systems of engagement that tie into those systems where there's a real criticality behind these solutions. So that was one big takeaway that we found was governance is going to be top of mind when we talk about container strategies moving forward.
Thanks, Lauren. That's fantastic. Now, with these conclusions in mind, Allison, how does Capital One's use of containers fit into the overall cloud strategy?
It's interesting. As Lauren was talking, we're going to take a slight tangent for a second. Way back around Docker 0.71, I believe it was, or 0.79 was when I first encountered containers. And I was actually leading a small engineering group in a database company. And we initially started using containers, much like Lauren said, in our test dev environments to verify operation. And very quickly, I think by the time I got to Docker 1.1 something, we realized we could actually give our product on a container. Someone could just run the container and go and not have to worry about install. And that's when all these light bulbs went off, in my opinion, personally, on what type of value could be there. And at that time, there was no Kubernetes. We're tens of containers. And I was ready to begin to see that management, orchestration, deployment headache beginning to form. You could see the pain that was coming down the pike as to how this usage of such an amazing enabling technology for that migration from on-prem to cloud, for that deployment wherever you go, for that consistency, was just so powerful. In fact, when we were, Lauren and I were talking a week and a half ago and talking about this orchestration, this development, and we look at Capital One, containers really do make the concept of cattle, not pets, the concept of don't patch, rebuild, and deploy as a standard operating practice. And that is a very powerful way to improve your security posture, to improve your understanding of what's actually running on your systems. And when you take a step back and talk about the container journey at Capital One, what may come as a surprise to many of you is that our journey started in 2016. During that time, we bought a company called Critical Stack, which had and has an opinionated view as to how container orchestration should happen, with a view toward defaulting to a more secure environment. Because when you start building things at scale, how you build, how you deploy, how you manage becomes even more important. Because if you do not know what's happening on your system, what's happening in your environment, what's happening in your cloud, then you're already losing the battle. What that means is that you'll not be able to be as reliable as you want. You'll not be able to be as stable as you want. You'll not be able to secure as you want. So you need to have this governance piece in place. And it's really hard. And taking back to some things Lauren said before about how companies are looking at that strategy, looking at the quick wins and the long-term piece, one of the phrases I like to say is your MVP sucks. The reason I say that is because when you start building some of those quick wins, you sometimes forget about the pieces around it that matter, which even comes back to, we are here at Capital One, and my own personal views is your container orchestration, deployment, governance policies. Build them early. You can now manage your cloud. It becomes so important. That's something, a lesson here that we at Capital learned as we went to the cloud, as we have continued our journey within the cloud, and as we go forward, is that we really do need to make sure that we understand what's happening. So we care and we manage where our container images come from. We care about how the infrastructure and orchestration works. Critical Stack was built inside of Capital One. It's open source now because the value is there, and we want the world to take advantage of that. We've built a ton of tooling to see what's actually happening and how to quickly fix things that are out of enforcement, out of policy. And this is something that we, especially in a regulated industry, knew we needed to do from the start. And even if you're not in a regulated industry, the value gained from having a strong governance, a strong orchestration, a strong policy pattern built around your cloud environment really does enable you to eventually build better and build faster because you know what's happening. And by knowing what's happening, you know where it's succeeding and failing.
Thanks to both of you for those powerful perspectives. With all of that in play, it seems like there's a huge opportunity for ensuring that resources in the cloud are well managed. Lauren, it'd be great to hear you talk a little bit about key takeaways from Forrester's best practices in cloud governance study.
Sure. So one of the big questions that companies have is, now we've reached this certain level of maturity, how do we think about governance? What is that next step forward? What's that next step in the maturity path that we need to do? And so we write a series of reports that talk about what are the best practices that your peers in the industry are doing around governance topics, whether that be security, so basics of identity and access management, around policies for an environment or a particular user, all the way to what repeatable items are you creating that are hardened, that are resilient for teams to reuse and be able to use as the standard within the organization. It includes things like cost. How do we think about cost management as an organization is enabling self-service access and enabling for this more innovative approach to building new products? How do you test something and then be able to have a formal process of shutting something down? And so in this best practices report, we kind of go through how you build a full governance process, whether that's talking about some of the basics where you start with just basic protection in terms of rules around individual access and control, as well as how you think about what that next step of is around training of people and reusable tools to make sure that there's as little gap possible from the initial launch to full remediation. And that's been part of the challenge in this is, if you're taking, if you think about this modernization journey as a three-legged stool, where you're changing the way that you build applications, you're changing the way that you deploy applications, and you're changing the architecture of the application itself. Companies tend to be really good at some of those and less mature at those different elements. That leads to a wobbly three-legged stool. And when organizations are trying to think about how they grow up and be able to actually reach some balance with those, they realize that there's some challenges when it comes to the speed. If they don't optimize or improve or modernize all of these different aspects, they find that there's delays and elements that are detrimental to being effective and being able to have a full, truly agile organization. And oftentimes the sticking points for companies is process. They find that they've been able to enable users to be able to build in new ways, but their processes are legacy, and to change those processes takes so many steps that oftentimes those processes go unchanged. And when containers were being used on premises, there was almost this bypass, or this way of saying, you can do this as long as it's behind our firewall, where we were able to kind of circumvent rather than think about and address governance shortcomings and process shortcomings. And we look at this next phase as we're reaching out and spanning into public cloud environments. That is no longer the case. Organizations are having to revisit this. You'll see a lot of major container shops starting to actually establish a center of excellence, a governance process and team. And in doing so, and not losing their audience, those that have made significant progress on these initiatives, they have to do so without compromising speed. And that is the hardest part. It is easy to be able to modernize some of these processes and to go step by step, but to do that without compromising speed at any point in that journey is incredibly difficult. And that's where there's a lot of organizations trying to figure out how to navigate those waters, especially when it comes to things. One of the things that came up in a lot of the interviews we did around sticking points is around the communication barriers that happen between teams, even when they've broken down silos into product teams, and also between financial officers on being able to convince a CFO to embrace more agile like financing, and being able to allow for the assurance that resources would be shut down if a project was ineffective. And those are some of the lessons that we were kind of teasing out in this research and showing some best practices from peers around how they were able to tackle these challenges and be able to move forward in kind of using containers at scale and looking at a more blended container environment that goes from on-prem into the public cloud.
Thanks, Lauren. There's a lot there to think about for sure. And Allison, I'd like to find out from you, how critical was it to establish solid controls and governance early in the process to enable Capital One to move to the cloud?
One of the things that really struck true as Lauren was talking in several cloud journeys that I've been on, and Maurice, we were on one together at iRobot, is that you really do need the whole company to be in, because it's a transformative experience. And if the whole company's not there and not participating, that three-legged stool gets very wobbly very, very quickly. And you find these sticking points that you just can't breakthrough. Capital One also had that same rationalization, realization early on. And what happened was fascinating. It was very quickly, Capital One realized that as a company, this transformation was more than just technology. And as the initial transformation began to happen, there were several other changes that happened within the greater Capital One. Governance and risk and cyber all became strong partners with engineering for this technological transformation. From the CEO all the way down to the teller, we knew that this was coming and we had to work together on this. There's no way to do it piecemeal. And that from the start meant that many of the harder things that Lauren was talking about, how do we build so that we can continue to build at speed and at scale? How do we build with understanding of what's happening within our system so we can meet and exceed the requirements of the government, our own internal requirements for how we treat our customers, our information, our data, our bank? All these pieces played a part from the very, very beginning of our journey. And because we had this unified vision across, it allowed us to make exceedingly hard decisions and make sure we stuck by it, even though on every journey there are sticking points that hit. For example, with Capital One, we knew that we would have to change our engineering. Our engineering is now close to, I think, 11,000 people within the engineering orgs across Capital One. That's a huge company-wide transformation for a bank. That led to all types of how do we bring in governance, which quickly early on led to, okay, how do we know what's happening in our system? And we build it early. In past lives, typically things like governance are left kind of, well, we'll do that in the 2.0 model, or we'll do that later on. And then that's where you hit that sticking point. You might go fast at the very beginning, but all of a sudden it gets harder and harder to make changes that are effective on your system. And the instability, because you don't have the monitoring around it to know what's actually happening, you begin to see your system get more and more unstable, so that more and more of your time is spent keeping the system up and running as opposed to adding new value, increasing the velocity of your work. That trade-off, if you will, becomes palpable. And in many companies, many products, when it gets to a point where you're just spending all your time maintaining a system, that's typically when a system gets re-architected and redone. If you find that sweet spot of growth where you can keep the monitoring in place, keep the understanding of how it's operating, keep the modern practices, quite frankly, that can allow you to keep your system running longer and innovating on it longer. And that innovation piece is one of the key reasons of why any company would want to move to the cloud and take advantage of all the modern processes around being a cloud-first company. And it really does come down to how you approach the work, how you bring about the mitigation to make sure that your network health and state are there. We at Capital One started building that with the product from day one, which means that we had an advantage going forward. It allowed us to move faster as we went forward because we could see what's happening. And it's such a critical piece that I can't help but reemphasize that as you start your cloud journey, do these hard things first. Don't leave them to the end. Make sure you have the buy-in to build that infrastructure first, because if you don't, your journey is going to be so much harder. And the pain that you feel, that your developers feel, that your management feels, that your marketing feels, that your sales feels, will be so much worse later on too. So really take those hard things and tie them early on to your system.
Thanks for that, Allison. I'd like to pick up on this a little bit in terms of the overall transformation and thinking about what the keys to success are for moving forward with better cloud governance. And a lot of that might have to do with cloud maturity. So Lauren, switching over, I'd like to understand, as the cloud's matured, could you share a little bit of an overview of which cloud governance trends Forrester predicts for 2021 and beyond?
Sure. So the main things that we see people revisiting, and when we say through this, Allison just went out and talked about doing it from the beginning. A lot of people haven't done it from the beginning. A lot of people thought about speed first. We talked a lot about this speed 1, speed 2 concept of how do we get some early wins and then get the rest of our environment built up or mature later on down the road. And for a lot of organizations, that's this phase. For those just starting off, you do have the advantage of that is the vogue thing to talk about in market now, is how you'll be handling governance and how you can build it in from the get-go. But a lot of folks are learning some of those lessons hard. They're trying to revisit their cloud strategy and think about, where are my issues? Where are the core problems that I'm facing today? Whether those are performance issues, whether those are security vulnerabilities, and they're trying to re-architect some of their networking decisions. That's one of the big areas we see come up. Another one is around data structure, strategy, and protection, how they're handling data movement across its hybrid environment. And then the other big one that's coming up a lot is around governance as it happens throughout an entire development process. So a lot of governance that happens today is kind of after the fact remediation. So they allow for the provisioning, whether it's in compliance or not. And then after the fact, they then look to correct and be able to remediate. But that's wasted time, and that's also unprotected time. So organizations are trying to front end that to bring it earlier in the decision process, to have it be at launch through repeatable tool sets, through education and visibility of data that's there, and be able to front load some of those demands. From the study that I talked about earlier that we did on container usage, one thing that came up where people were having the biggest challenges with container usage, a lot of it was on runtime monitoring, and then around on just doing monitoring of performance for containers at scale. How do they have something that's reliable and dependable and repeatable across all of their different solutions? So those are some of the things that are coming up. Some of the other conversations that are top of mind is around what's our strategy in terms of clusters? Do we do large clusters and few of them, or do we actually do lots of small clusters? And so trying to make those decisions based on identity and access management and rules in our particular industry on how we think about access for our regulatory requirements. So those are some of the most recent concepts. The other thing I'll throw in there, my colleague Charlie Betts did a really interesting study. He reached out to over 20 chief innovation officers and a number of other thought leaders in the market around this topic of innovation. How do you embrace innovation as an organization? How do you break down silos between different groups? How do you think about communication challenges? How do you think about spanning DevOps even outside of dev and ops organizations, into supply chain, into R&D, into customer support centers, and think about enabling this next wave of innovation as a company to be adaptable, resilient, and creative in that process as well, in what we call future fit. And some of the main things in the governance conversation that came out of that was this concept of wide boulevards and high curbs, of this element of giving freedom to move, experiment, but then make it very difficult to be able to violate specific governance policies, and make it very difficult and very to actually violate a policy to go outside of those boundaries that are created, to make the natural flow, make the natural fit very easy to operate within these wide boulevards. And that being an approach a lot of companies are taking in terms of modern governance. He also talked about some of the communication elements and almost this assurance, this trust in that there is efficiency built into the process, that there is some of these more financial governance practices in place. So a revisiting of spend, a shutting down of projects that were not successful, a cloud cost optimization tool that shuts down unattached IP addresses, and look for elements where you might have the wrong family type or instance size to be able to identify some of these issues with right sizing of your resources. So being able to have some of those controls and insurances to steer you in the right direction. So those are the major trends that I've been seeing. A lot of the themes are around the revisiting of inefficiencies and problems, and looking for this kind of element of to be resilient in some of our more modern and new elements, while also trying to revisit the people, the communication, the marketing, the communication that happens between the key stakeholders involved.
Awesome, thank you. All that sets us up for our final topic today, how all of this creates and strengthens a culture of innovation within the company.
So what I look for in innovative culture, does everyone feel safe to voice their opinion? Do you have different opinions on your teams? How people feel safe voicing a different opinion, a different thought, a different idea? That to me really begins to get to how you find innovation, because when people feel safe, when people feel that they can bring out ideas and try new things within the wide boulevard, high curb model, because I love that statement, that is how you truly begin to develop innovation in processes, in software development, across the board, which is why at Capital One, building that inclusive culture, making the smaller teams to foster the communication that Lauren was talking about, getting to know the people around you. So here at Capital One, we've been doing so much to try and foster that, to help teams find that connective tissue, even in this era of Zoom, WebEx, pick your video client du jour, to really make sure that people can still connect and have that culture. Because when you have that culture, when you have the guardrails, if you will, I said the box that you can be innovative in, then you can really look at how to change the game, how you can begin to bring new ideas to the forefront. Within Capital One, there's a couple of different pieces here I want to highlight really quick. One is we look at the tools that we bring in and potentially the companies we invest in. We just recently saw Snowflake go IPO. That was a technology we were an early adopter on. It's a technology that we utilize heavily inside. We've built a lot of infrastructure around that tool. And it's a company that we also invested and made sure that they were successful so we could be successful. That's one way of doing innovation at a bank and be successful at it, looking for those other innovative places and nurturing and utilizing their tech. We have a whole strategic investment arm, Capital One Ventures. This really does figure out how we can invest and also use those companies internal as well. So again, it's how do we reach out to the community to bring up and coming tech into our company to really keep us cutting edge. Internally, we have something called the labs. This and the garage. These are areas where new ideas are tried out within Capital One. And a lot of them do get traction and move forward to become products that our customers get to enjoy, love, use, and really helps change the game. And then we have within our own culture here too, of how we're adopting using containers. How do we build the guardrails so our teams can be innovative? What are those guardrails? How to put the policies in place so our teams can be successful?
Allison, thank you so much for that. And Lauren as well. This was really, really great today. We really appreciate the time you both took to have this fireside chat here. And for everyone watching, thank you very much for joining us as well today. And if you'd like to learn more about Capital One's tech journey, you can go to www.capitalone.com/tech. You can also follow us on Twitter at Capital One Tech, all one word. Thank you.